never wrote this down when it mattered. In 1938, our unit was ordered to patrol a storm-lashed stretch of coast that did not exist on any public map. The officers called it a routine security sweep. The locals called it a mourning shore. What we heard that night was not artillery, not wind, and not human. High Command sealed the report within hours, labeling it mass hysteria caused by exhaustion and weather exposure. But hysteria does not know my name or scream it back across the sea. I have carried that sound for decades. If this record survives, let it be known we did not imagine her. Something was already waiting on that coast before we arrived. Welcome to Combat Lore Files, where the shadows of war live on. Hit subscribe and get nightly drops of stories like this. Some orders arrive stamped in ink. Others arrive already soaked in dread. The reassignment came before dawn, slipped under the barracks door while the rest of the base still slept. I remember the paper felt damp when I picked it up, as if it had already traveled through rain. The envelope bore no unit crest, no routing stamp, only my name typed too carefully. When I unfolded the orders, the language was precise and empty at the same time. Coastal Security Detail. Effective immediately. No explanation. No duration. No margin for refusal. I had been a soldier long enough to recognize when High Command wanted obedience, not questions. By sunrise, my squad was assembled, boots laced, rifles checked, each of us pretending this was just another march. We boarded transport trucks under a sky the color of dirty steel. The engines coughed and rattled, drowning out conversation, but I could feel the unease humming between us like static. Our lieutenant read from a briefing folder that looked thinner than it should have been. The maps he passed around were old, edges frayed, the coastline marked only with vague contour lines and a blank stretch where villages should have been. Storm exposure, he said. Foreign surveillance risk. That was all. No mention of enemy units. No mention of civilians. Every military instinct I had told me something was being withheld. As we drove west, the land changed. Farmland gave way to rock and scrub. The air grew heavier, carrying the smell of salt long before we saw the sea. Clouds rolled low and fast, pressed down by an unseen hand. The road narrowed, tires crunching over gravel and wet earth. I watched the men across from me checking their weapons again and again, not out of discipline, but nerves. Even the radio operator frowned at his set, tapping the casing as bursts of static bled through the speaker like distant whispers. By midday, we passed the first village. It wasn't marked on any map. Houses crouched low against the wind. Roofs weighted with stones. An old woman stood near the road, her black shawl snapping violently as we rolled past. She did not wave. She did not spit or curse. She simply raised 2 fingers and drew them slowly across her lips, sealing them shut. I told myself it was nothing, some local superstition, some meaningless gesture. But my stomach tightened anyway. We dismounted several kilometers short of the coast and continued on foot. Boots sank into damp soil with every step, the sound thick and sucking, as if the ground resented letting us go. Fog drifted in sheets, swallowing the path ahead and leaving the world reduced to a few meters of visibility. I could hear the sea now, though we hadn't reached it. Not the rhythmic crash I expected, but something deeper, uneven, like breathing slowed by pain. The locals began to appear along the route without warning. They stood at the edge of the fog, half-formed shapes wrapped in coats and scarves too old to place their age. They spoke to each other in low voices, a dialect rough and lilting, older than the standardized German barked by our NCOs. I caught fragments of words I didn't understand. Repeated again and again. One of them made eye contact with me. His eyes pale and shining. He shook his head slowly, deliberately, as if mourning something that had not yet happened. Our point man cursed under his breath and tightened his grip on his rifle. They look at us like we're already dead. He muttered. I snapped at him to keep moving, but the thought lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. The wind picked up, carrying with it a high, distant sound. At first, I mistook it for gulls, then it stretched longer, thinner, rising and falling in a way that made the hair on my arms lift. It was gone as quickly as it came, swallowed by the roar of the wind. When we finally crested the last rise, the coast revealed itself. The sea was a dark, churning expanse, waves slamming against jagged rocks with violent force. White foam clawed upward, reaching for the land like grasping hands. The sky above it all was bruised purple and gray, rain threatening but never quite falling. Our designated patrol sector stretched along the cliffs, a strip of hostile ground battered endlessly by wind and water. There were no fortifications, no friendly positions, no signs of recent enemy movement. Just emptiness, raw and exposed. We established a temporary perimeter, driving stakes into the earth for signal lines, setting up observation posts overlooking the black water as I scanned the horizon through my binoculars. The glass vibrated slightly in my hands, not from the wind, but from something else, a low vibration that I felt more than heard. The radio crackled behind me, dissolving into shrill static. The operator swore and adjusted the dial. "It's like something's blocking the signal," he said. "But there's nothing out there." Toward evening, the locals returned. They did not cross into our perimeter. They stood just beyond it, faces drawn and tense. One man stepped forward and spoke in broken German. His voice shaking, he pointed toward the rocks below the cliffs, then to his ears, then made a slicing motion across his throat. "When the sea cries," he said slowly, "men follow." Our lieutenant ordered him away, threatened arrest for interference. The man did not argue, he only backed into the fog, his eyes never leaving us. As night fell, the wind intensified, carrying salt spray that coated our faces and weapons. The sea grew louder, angrier, its rhythm irregular and unsettling. That I stood my watch staring into the darkness, trying to convince myself this was just another assignment. Another patch of ground to secure. Another nameless stretch of war. But deep down, I knew we had been sent somewhere wrong. Somewhere that did not belong to us. We believed fear belonged to civilians, until the sea began watching us back. Silence is never empty. Sometimes it is only waiting to be filled. The first night on the coast taught me that this place did not obey the rules I had learned in uniform. Darkness settled quickly, not gradually like it did inland, but all at once, as if someone had lowered a heavy curtain over the sea. Our lantern light struggled against the fog, turning it into shifting walls that closed, and no matter how far we spaced the posts, the wind eased after midnight, and with it came a quiet so deep it pressed against my ears until they rang. I remember thinking that even the ocean seemed to be holding its breath. That was when the sound arrived. It was faint at first, carried on the edge of hearing, so distant I wondered if it existed at all. A long, wavering note, rising and falling unevenly, stretched thin by the wind. It did not repeat like a signal horn or echo like a shout. It lingered, faded, then returned slightly altered, as if testing the air. I stood still, rifle tight against my chest, listening harder than I ever had before. Behind me, the radio crackled without warning. The operator whispered my name, panic sharp in his voice. The set was alive with static, a shrill hiss that surged and collapsed in irregular waves. He swore it had been clear moments earlier, when he adjusted the frequency. The static briefly dropped into silence before snapping back louder than before. Almost screaming, I felt a cold pressure crawl up my spine, the irrational sense that something had noticed our attempt to listen. By the second patrol cycle, the men were jumpy. Compasses refused to settle, their needles twitching and drifting no matter how often they were recalibrated. A veteran sergeant accused the equipment officer of sabotage until he saw his own compass misbehave in his palm. Maps became unreliable reference points, landmarks appearing subtly different with each pass, as if the coastline shifted when we weren't looking. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the same distant sound threading its way into dreams. I began writing everything down, not official reports, but personal notes tucked into the back of my field journal, times, directions, wind speed. The quality of the sound, I compared it to artillery, to sirens, to wounded animals. None fit. The tone carried too much variation, too much intention. When the wind died completely, the sound did not vanish. It softened, thinned, but remained, floating over the rocks like a warning suspended in air. On the third night, I was on cliff watch alone when the quiet broke again. This time the sound traveled lower, closer to the waterline. I leaned over the edge, heart hammering, scanning the black surface below. Waves surged and collapsed against the rocks, spraying white foam that glowed faintly in the moonlight. And there, beneath it all, was the sound again, now clearer, less distorted by distance. It curved upward at the end, like breath drawn sharply through clenched teeth. From the corner of my vision, I saw movement. Not a figure, not yet, but a disturbance where there should have been none. The surface of the water rippled outward in slow rings, as if something below had risen just enough to displace the sea. then settled back into hiding. That I told myself it was a current, a trick of light, anything that allowed me to stay standing where I was. When I reported it, the lieutenant dismissed the details but could not ignore the growing strain in the unit. Men snapped at each other over trivial matters. Point one collapsed during patrol, shaking uncontrollably, unable to explain why his chest felt crushed. The medic found nothing wrong and blamed exhaustion. Yet even when ordered to rest, sleep refused to come. That I could hear muttering in the dark, whispered prayers from men who had laughed at superstition days earlier. The locals avoided the cliffs entirely now. They watched us from farther inland, their silhouettes small against the hills. Point one night, I approached an old man who lingered near the path. He looked past me toward the sea, his lips moving silently. When I asked what he was saying, he swallowed hard and replied, "Counting." He would not explain what he meant. By the fifth night, the sound changed. It no longer wandered aimlessly. It followed the patrol routes, drifting closer when we approached the cliffs, retreating when we fell back. It rose during moments of quiet, dropped during shouted commands, as if reacting to our presence. I noted how it never coincided with waves breaking or wind gusts. It existed independently, its own pattern layered atop the natural world. The radio finally went dead just after midnight. Not static silence. The operator pounded the casing, checked cables, replaced components. Nothing. That we were cut off completely, isolated on a strip of land that now felt less like terrain and more like a boundary between worlds. As I stood there listening to the distant cry once more, I realized something that chilled me deeper than fear. The sound was no longer shapeless. It was forming syllables. What began as noise soon took shape, and a voice. Some truths survive not because they are written down, but because people are too afraid to forget them. The morning after the radio died, fog clung to the coast so thick it muted distance and sound alike. Our unit moved slower, tighter, boots scraping stone with deliberate care. That I could feel eyes on us long before I saw anyone. The same sensation as standing before an ambush without knowing where the rifles were hidden. When the locals finally emerged, they did not approach as a crowd. They came one by one, cautiously, as if stepping too close might draw something's attention. A fisherman was the first to speak to me directly. He smelled of brine and old nets. His hands cracked and trembling despite the mild cold. He stared at the cliffs behind us, not at my face, and asked in broken German how long we planned to stay. When I told him I didn't know, his shoulders sagged, relief and fear crossing his expression at the same time. He muttered something in his own tongue, then looked at me sharply and asked if we had heard her yet. I asked him who he meant. He hesitated, glanced toward the sea, and lowered his voice as though it could hear him. "The one who cries before the dead arrive," he said slowly. "She has many names. Some say she walks, some say she waits, but she always sings." My training urged me to dismiss it as folklore, a superstition shaped by isolation and weather. But the word sings echoed uncomfortably with what I had been documenting in my journal. Other villagers gathered nearby, whispering among themselves. An elderly woman traced a symbol in the dirt with the tip of her cane. A looping mark that ended in a slash. She spat over it and covered it with her boot. When I asked what it meant, she shook her head violently and refused to speak further. A younger man translated part of it for me. His voice tight, he said it marked places where grief had already passed through, leaving echoes behind. Back at the perimeter, the men reacted poorly to the interaction. Some laughed too loudly, mocking the accents and gestures. Others said nothing, eyes fixed on the horizon. One private asked me if the locals had mentioned when it would happen. When I pressed him, he admitted he dreamed of drowning the night before, water filling his lungs while someone screamed above the waves. The medic overheard and threatened disciplinary action for spreading panic. That only made the silence heavier. That evening, I returned to the cliffs with my notebook. The air was still, the sea dark and glossy like oil poured over stone. When the sound came, it arrived without warning, closer than ever before. It rose from below the rocks, stretched thin, then fell sharply, like a lament cut short. I wrote furiously, hands shaking as I tried to capture its rhythm. Its rise and collapse, the pattern repeated 3 times, each cycle slightly altered, as if adjusting to my presence. Behind me, footsteps crunched on gravel. I turned, expecting a patrolman, but found the fisherman again. He had followed the path without sound, his face pale in the dim light. He listened for a moment, eyes closing, then whispered a single word I didn't recognize. When I asked him to repeat it, he translated reluctantly, Mourner, he said. Not for one man, for many. He told me the stories he had learned as a child, passed down through families that lived and died by the sea. Long before uniforms, before borders, before wars with names, there was a presence tied to the coast. She appeared before storms that never ended, before ships vanished, before battles that left the shore littered with bodies that he insisted she did not kill, she warned. But men rarely listened. I wanted to argue, to point out how fear could shape memory, how sound carried strangely over water. But the sea answered for him. The cry returned, longer this time, lingering until it felt etched into the air itself that I felt pressure behind my eyes, an overwhelming urge to look away, to kneel, to do anything except listen. The fisherman crossed himself in a motion unfamiliar to me and backed away without another word. That night, the dreams spread. One man woke screaming, clutching his helmet like a life preserver. Another refused to leave his post, insisting something would take his place if he moved. The sound returned intermittently, threading through the hours of darkness, no longer distant but circling, as if mapping our positions. That I noted how it rose whenever someone spoke too loudly, how it softened when we fell silent. At dawn, a gull lay dead near the rocks, its body unmarked, eyes clouded and staring. The locals would not come near it. They stood at a distance, murmuring prayers and refusing to meet our gaze. That I felt a creeping certainty settle into my bones, cold and immovable. This coast was not cursed by chance. That it was claimed. Legends are easy to ignore until they start predicting the future. Death did not arrive screaming. It arrived quietly, as if it had already been invited. The body was found just before dawn, when the sky was still undecided between night and morning. One of our sentries, a quiet man named Kruger, lay near the lower watch path where the cliffs dipped closest to the rocks below. He was on his back, arms stiff at his sides, rifle still slung properly across his chest. There was no sign of struggle and no blood and no marks that suggested a fall or attack at first glance. It looked like he had simply lain down and stopped living. That illusion shattered when I knelt beside him. His eyes were open too wide, whites fully visible, pupils fixed as if something enormous had filled his vision in his final moment. His mouth was parted slightly, lips bluish, frozen around an expression that was not pain but recognition. The medic checked for wounds, then pulse, then breath, growing paler with each step. Kruger's ears were stained dark, a thin line of dried blood tracing down his neck as if it had leaked out rather than spilled. Word spread fast. Men gathered despite orders, forming a silent ring around the body. The wind was calm, the sea unnaturally subdued, waves rolling in without force. That I realized then what unsettled me most. The sound was absent. No distant sea or white no whisper carried on the air, just a heavy quiet that pressed down harder than any noise we had heard before. The medic finally spoke, voice unsteady. He said Kruger's heart had simply stopped. No trauma, no poison, no clear cause. He suggested shock, perhaps a congenital weakness, anything that could fit inside a report. But no one believed it. Not fully. That we all knew what we had heard the night before, that low, wandering lament threading through the dark, and Kruger had been on watch alone when it came closest. High command was notified through an emergency courier sent inland on foot, since the radio remained useless. While we waited for instructions, the lieutenant ordered us back to routine patrols, as if discipline alone could stitch reality back into place. Men complied, but their movements were mechanical, eyes darting constantly toward the sea and the fog beyond. The coastline felt altered, as if Kruger's death had shifted something unseen. That night, the sound returned. It did not announce itself gradually. This time it rose suddenly, sharp and piercing, slicing through the air with such force that several men clutched their ears. That I dropped to one knee instinctively, heart racing, every nerve screaming danger. The cry carried a layered quality now, as if more than one voice overlapped slightly out of sync. That it rolled across the water, rebounded off the cliffs, and wrapped around us from all directions. I tried to record it again, hands shaking so badly my writing slanted across the page. The pitch climbed higher than before, then dropped abruptly, leaving behind a ringing silence that made my teeth ache. One man vomited without warning. Another laughed hysterically until he had to be restrained, and I felt something inside my chest tighten. A deep, irrational certainty that the sound was not random. That it was deliberate. From the cliffs, I saw movement below. A pale shape stood where the rocks met the sea, indistinct but upright, unmoving despite the wind tugging violently at everything else around it. For a heartbeat, I was convinced it was another local, some fool who had wandered too close. But no human could stand there, balanced against the crashing waves, untouched by spray. The shape did not advance, it did not retreat, it simply remained. A vertical line against the chaos of water. The cry peaked again, longer this time, and I felt it vibrate through my bones. Images flashed behind my eyes, not as dreams, but as impressions, figures lying broken along the shore. Bodies pulled from the water days too late, helmets floating empty in the surf. I gasped, breaking the trance, and the sound cut off abruptly, leaving the night hollow and wrong. By morning, High Command's response arrived. Brief, curt. Instructions were clear. Kruger's death was to be logged as natural causes, no mention of sound, no mention of anomalies, no further interaction with locals beyond essential logistics. The lieutenant read the order aloud, jaw tight, then folded the paper carefully as if afraid it might tear. As we prepared to move the body inland, the locals appeared again, drawn as if by instinct. They did not approach. They watched from the fog, faces grim, some making signs against evil, others simply bowing their heads. One woman wailed softly when she saw the covered form being carried away, her voice breaking into a thin, quivering note that echoed disturbingly close to what we had heard from the sea. That was when the realization settled fully into my mind. Kruger had not died because of the cry, he had died before it. The sound had not been a threat, it had been an announcement. As darkness approached once more, the sea began to stir, and I knew the next night would not be content with taking only one of us. What began as a warning was preparing to demand an answer. Some sounds are heard with the ears. Others are felt in the bones long before the mind understands. That night arrived heavy and swollen, the kind that presses down on the world until breathing feels like work. Clouds rolled low and fast, tearing across the sky in uneven layers while the wind shifted without rhythm. Striking from different directions as if confused, we were ordered into full readiness. Flares prepared, rifles loaded, bayonets fixed, not because of enemy intelligence, but because fear had finally infected command itself. No one said the word out loud, but we all knew we were waiting for her. The sea changed first. It darkened beyond its usual black, losing reflection entirely, swallowing moonlight as if depth itself had thickened. Waves no longer broke naturally. They rose, paused, then collapsed with delayed violence, spraying foam that hissed like steam when it struck the rocks. The air tasted metallic, sharp on my tongue, and every breath felt borrowed. I was positioned near the lower cliff path when the sound returned, not drifting this time. Not distant. It rose directly from below. A piercing wail that cut through wind and surf alike. The pitch climbed impossibly high, then fractured, splitting into layered tones that twisted around each other like threads being pulled too tight. Men shouted orders that were instantly swallowed. I dropped to one knee, pressing my palm against the rock, feeling vibration pulse through the stone itself. Flares shot into the sky, bathing the cliffs in harsh white light. For a brief moment, the fog thinned, and that was when I saw her. She stood on a narrow outcropping just above the waterline, where no footing should have been possible. Her shape was tall, unnaturally still, outlined against the roiling sea. Her hair streamed outward, not blown by the wind but lifted as if submerged. Her face was pale, indistinct, yet unmistakably turned toward us. The wail did not come from her mouth alone. It came from everywhere around her, as if the sea itself had learned her voice. My rifle felt useless in my hands. Some men fired anyway, muzzle flashes strobing the darkness. The shots vanished into mist and spray, producing no reaction, no recoil of fear, no movement. The sound only intensified, vibrating through my chest until it felt like my ribs might split apart. Images flooded my mind without warning. Not visions, not dreams, but memories that did not belong to me. Men drowning under gray skies. Bodies piled along beaches I had never seen. Flags torn and trampled that I tasted. Salt and blood and something older, bitter and ancient. Around me, discipline collapsed. One soldier fell to his knees, screaming apologies in a language I did not recognize. Another dropped his weapon and clawed at his ears until blood streaked down his fingers. The corporal who had laughed at the locals days earlier stood frozen, tears streaming down his face, whispering a name over and over though no one asked who it belonged to. I tried to shout, to command, to do something that fit the shape of training, but my voice would not rise above a hoarse rasp. The wail reached its peak, stretching impossibly long, vibrating the air until it shimmered, Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. That IT felt wrong, artificial. As if sound itself had been stripped away, that I realized I was still staring at the rocks below. Heart hammering so hard it blurred my vision. The outcropping was empty. She was gone. No retreat, no splash, no trace that she had ever stood there at all. Rain began to fall then, cold and heavy, breaking the silence with relentless force. Men collapsed where they stood, gasping, shaking, some laughing in disbelief. Others stared out at the sea, eyes hollow, as if something essential had been taken from them. The lieutenant tried to reassert order, his voice cracking as he issued commands that no one fully obeyed. We gathered the wounded, those bleeding from ears or mouths, those unable to stand without help. I looked down at my hands and realized my notebook had been crushed in my grip, pages soaked through with rain and sweat. The last thing I had written was unfinished, a jagged line trailing off mid-word. That I understood then that documenting was no longer enough. We were no longer observers, we were participants in something far older and far larger than our presence on this coast. As dawn crept in, pale and reluctant, the sea calmed unnaturally fast. The storm withdrew without warning, leaving behind a smooth, deceptive surface that reflected the gray sky like polished glass. No one spoke of what they had seen. We did not need to. The knowledge sat between us, heavy and undeniable. We had not encountered an enemy. We had been acknowledged. Survival no longer felt like a matter of tactics or endurance. It felt like a question of whether the sea would allow us to leave at all. War teaches men how to face death. It does not teach them how to face inevitability. Mourning did not bring relief. It only revealed the damage more clearly. The shoreline looked unchanged at first glance. Same jagged rocks, same gray water, but the men were different. Eyes were sunken, voices sounded distant, as if spoken from behind thick glass. The chain of command still existed on paper, yet something vital had snapped during the night, an invisible thread that discipline alone could not mend. One sentry never returned from rotation. We found his rifle stacked neatly beside the path, helmet placed on top as if he had performed a final inspection before walking away. His boot prints led toward the inland hills, then vanished abruptly in soft earth. No signs of struggle, no blood, no explanation. The lieutenant ordered a search, but it was half-hearted, more ritual than belief. Every man knew he had not deserted out of fear of punishment, that he had fled from something else. By midday, arguments broke out over nothing. A canteen knocked over. A misheard order. A glance held too long. One corporal accused another of drawing the sound closer by talking about it. The idea spread faster than reason. Men lowered their voices, then stopped speaking altogether, communicating through gestures and looks thick with accusation. I felt it too. The growing sense that attention itself carried weight here, that being noticed, by the sea, by whatever waited beyond it, was dangerous. The next patrol cycle collapsed entirely. One soldier froze mid-step, eyes locked on the horizon, whispering that the water was rising even though the tide was going out. Another began digging frantically into the wet soil with his bare hands, insisting something had been buried alive beneath the cliffs. When restrained, he sobbed uncontrollably, repeating that he had heard his own name carried on the wind. The medic sedated him and avoided meeting anyone's gaze afterward. I tried to hold on to procedure, to structure, to the familiar comfort of routine. I checked watches, logged weather patterns, inspected weapons. But even metal felt unreliable now. Rifle bolts jammed for no clear reason. Compass needles spun lazily before settling on contradictory bearings. The radio remained dead, a useless box of wire and silence that reminded us how completely alone we were. That afternoon, the corporal who had once laughed loudest at superstition broke entirely. He marched straight to the cliff edge during broad daylight, ignoring shouted orders, and fired his rifle into the sea until the magazine ran dry. Each shot echoed sharply against the rocks. Swallowed instantly by the vastness below, he screamed apologies between trigger pulls, voice cracking, words tumbling over each other without sense. By the time we reached him, he had collapsed to his knees, staring down at the water as if expecting an answer. I looked where he pointed. The surface of the sea was calm, deceptively peaceful, but beneath it I sensed movement not tied to current or tide, a pressure, a presence. The sound did not come then, yet I felt it hovering just beyond hearing, coiled and patient. The corporal was removed from duty, eyes vacant, lips still moving silently as if in prayer. High Command finally responded to our earlier courier. The message arrived late, delivered by a junior officer who would not meet our eyes. The directive was clinical medical evaluations. Immediate stress assessments and no mention of deaths or desertions beyond internal classification. We were ordered to prepare for possible withdrawal, pending further review. The tone suggested embarrassment rather than concern, as if the greater threat was not what haunted the coast, but how it would look in official records. That night, I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt watched, measured, as if something beyond the cliffs was counting breaths. That I stood alone near the perimeter, listening to the sea lap softly against stone. The sound returned without rising, without warning. Not a full wail but a low, controlled note that slid beneath the wind. That I felt it inside my skull, vibrating, thoughts loose. Images surfaced again, clearer now. This time they were specific, uniforms like ours, different insignia, different years, lying broken along the same stretch of coast. That I understood then that we were not the first to hear her, and we would not be the last. Something shifted inside me in that moment. Not panic, not disbelief, acceptance. That I realized that whatever haunted this place did not act out of malice. That it acted out of certainty. The knowledge was almost comforting in its own terrible way. That at least chaos had a pattern. Just before dawn, the sound faded completely, leaving behind an oppressive stillness. The sea withdrew slightly, exposing more of the rocks than I had seen before, slick and black like exposed bone. That I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, not out of fear for my life, but out of respect, as one leaves a grave undisturbed. When the sun finally rose, pale and weak, it illuminated faces that no longer resembled soldiers. We had crossed an unseen threshold. We were still alive, still armed, still standing on foreign ground, but something essential had already been stripped away. High Command would call it exhaustion, combat stress, environmental factors. They would never name the real cause, and the coast did not care what we called it. By morning, the decision to remove us had already been made. We just did not know it yet. Some endings do not come with funerals. They come with paperwork. The withdrawal order arrived without ceremony, no trumpet, no urgency. Just a sealed directive delivered by a staff officer who looked relieved to hand it over and be gone. The language was precise, sanitized, stripped of everything that had bled into our days on that coast. Elevated stress indicators, reduced operational efficiency, potential environmental factors posing risk to unit cohesion. We were to evacuate immediately, leave no equipment behind, and submit to full medical and psychological evaluation inland. The shoreline itself was not mentioned at all, as if refusing to name it might erase it. Men did not cheer. They did not question it either. The relief was quiet, brittle, mixed with something closer to shame. That we packed in silence, dismantling posts we had struggled to hold, rolling cables that had never carried a signal, stamping out fires that had never truly warmed us. The sea watched, calm and unreadable, offering no sound, no farewell. That I found that absence more unsettling than the Wail itself. Before departure, officers confiscated personal notes, journals, and unofficial records. That I hesitated when my turn came, fingers lingering on the worn cover of my notebook. The clerk barely glanced at it before placing it in a canvas sack already heavy with paper. "For review," he said, avoiding my eyes. That I knew then I would never see it again. Not the measurements, not the descriptions, not the truth as I had tried to trap it in ink. Medical tents were set up hastily near the road. Every man was examined, questioned, tested. They asked about sleep patterns, hallucinations, fear responses. They did not ask what we had seen. They did not ask what we had heard. When someone tried to explain anyway, the doctors exchanged looks and wrote faster, nodding with rehearsed understanding. This was not investigation. That it was containment. As we boarded the transport trucks, the locals gathered at a distance once more. They did not block the road. They did not curse or plead. They simply watched us leave with expressions that held neither relief nor anger, only inevitability. An old woman raised her hand slowly and pressed it to her chest, then extended it toward the sea, a gesture that felt less like goodbye and more like acknowledgement. As the engine lurched forward, I swore I heard a faint sound carry across the wind. Not a wail. Not a warning. A low, satisfied hush. Inland, the evaluations continued. Our unit was split apart deliberately, reassigned to different posts, different commands, different regions. We were instructed not to discuss the deployment with anyone outside official channels, under threat of disciplinary action. The wording was clear enough to leave no room for interpretation. What happened on the coast was to remain there. Files disappeared. Casualty reports were revised. Kruger's name was listed under natural causes, his death stripped of context and consequence. The missing sentry was quietly marked as deserter, his record amended to suggest cowardice rather than terror. It was efficient. It was thorough. It was wrong. And yet, part of me understood the necessity. War runs on narratives as much as weapons. Some truths corrode morale too effectively to be allowed daylight. Weeks passed, then months that I found myself stationed far from the sea, surrounded by noise, machinery, human chaos. The nights were louder here, filled with engines and shouting and distant artillery, and yet, I slept worse than I ever had on the coast. In silence. I could still hear it, not the sound itself, but its absence, the space it had carved into my thoughts. I would wake drenched in sweat, convinced for a moment that the walls were breathing, that the air itself was preparing to cry out. I learned to keep my mouth shut, so did the others. When our paths crossed by chance, we exchanged brief looks of recognition and nothing more. No one asked questions that might demand answers. We had been trained well. Years later, fragments surfaced in whispers. A replacement unit assigned to coastal fortification duty. Vague reports of environmental anomalies. A sudden artillery barrage ordered against empty shoreline positions with no strategic value. The entire sector abandoned soon after, declared unsuitable for long-term operations. The official reasons shifted depending on who told the story: erosion, logistical inefficiency, unstable terrain. The locals never returned to that stretch of coast. No new villages, no fishing routes, no markers on modern maps. It became a blank space once more, just as it had been when we arrived, and still sailors avoided it. Some claimed their instruments failed when passing nearby. Others spoke of sounds carried across calm water on nights when storms were due. I never went back. But I did not need to. The coast followed me in subtler ways. In the way I listened too closely when the wind rose. In the way certain pitches made my chest tighten without reason. In the understanding that not all warnings come in forms we respect. The record succeeded in one sense. What we experienced was erased from official history. No reports. No testimony. No acknowledgement. But erasure is not the same as absence. Some things do not need to be written down to endure. They wait. Some echoes do not fade. They wait for history to repeat itself. I survived the war. That fact alone once felt like victory, then obligation, and finally a burden I learned to carry quietly. Years passed, borders shifted, uniforms changed. The world rebuilt itself with fresh lies layered over old ruins. Yet the coast never left me. Not in dreams. Not in waking moments when the wind rose just right and carried a pitch too thin to ignore. I learned that survival does not mean escape. Sometimes it only means distance. Long after the fighting ended, I found references buried in unrelated reports. Artillery logs noting unexplained morale collapse during coastal operations. Ship manifests listing vessels that never reached harbor, lost without distress calls in calm weather. Medical records citing auditory hallucinations among seasoned troops assigned briefly to western shorelines. The dates varied. The flags differed. But the pattern was unmistakable. Every few years, someone was sent to that edge of land, and every few years, the sea answered. I met a former naval officer once in a crowded station cafe. He was drunk enough to talk and careful enough to speak in fragments. When I mentioned the coast, not by name but by description, his hand froze around his cup. He asked me if I had heard it too. Not seen. Not believed. Heard. That was when I understood the truth we had all circled but never voiced. The cry was not bound to one war or one nation. It did not belong to us. We merely passed through its path. Age brought clarity that fear had denied me then. I no longer believed the Banshee was a creature in the way soldiers understand enemies. She did not stalk. She did not hunt. She did not choose sides. She marked moments. She announced convergence points where death would gather in numbers too large to ignore. The locals had been right. She did not cause the tide. She sang before it turned. I returned to the region once, decades later, as a civilian. The road no longer existed. The village names had been erased or absorbed into administrative districts. No signs pointed toward the cliffs. I walked as far as I could, stopping when the land itself seemed to resist further passage. The air felt heavier there, unchanged despite the years. I did not hear the cry. That was worse, somehow. It meant she did not need to speak yet. Standing there, I understood why the records were buried. Why officers chose denial over investigation. Why legends survive alongside wars like scars on the same body. To acknowledge her would mean admitting that not all deaths are chaotic, that some tragedies arrive with advance notice, and that knowing does not always grant the power to prevent them. The moral weight of that knowledge is unbearable to institutions built on control. War demands the illusion of command. That coast stripped it away completely. It reminded us that history moves on rails laid long before uniforms and orders, and sometimes all a soldier can do is listen as it passes. I have told no one this story in full. Until now. Not because I fear punishment or disbelief, but because stories like this are not warnings in the way people want. They do not offer solutions. They offer awareness. And awareness does not stop the tide. It only tells you when to look away or when to remember. If this account endures, let it serve not as proof, but as context. The world is older than our conflicts. The land remembers more than our archives. And when the sea begins to cry, it is not asking for belief. It is reminding us that war is never the first voice raised in mourning. This story is inspired by documented wartime reports, blended with folklore, and dramatized for narrative purposes.